And we appreciate the relationship we've had with the Trinity Forum, who have helped us get great speakers at MBA and in the Nashville community. And it is my pleasure to introduce now Cherie Harder, President of the Trinity Forum, who will introduce Mr. David Brooks. Join me in thanking Cherie and the Trinity Forum.
Well, thank you, Brad, for that introduction, and welcome to all of you in joining us for tonight's evening conversation with David Brooks on character and leadership in a divisive age. We're really delighted again to partner with you, Brad, and with the Montgomery Bell Academy. As many of you in this audience know, this is not the first time that we have partnered. For the last 6 years, Trinity Forum, Montgomery Bell Academy, along with a secondary partner, St. Paul's Christian Academy, have partnered to bring 2 evening conversations a year here to Nashville. We've heard from everyone from Oxford mathematician John Lennox to California's poet laureate Dana Gioia on topics ranging from poetry and beauty in a fallen world to just war theory to science and faith and the like. But as Brad mentioned, tonight is a truly special night. We're delighted to be in a new auditorium here at the Pascal Auditorium and to collaborate once again with the Montgomery Bell Academy in bringing David Brooks to Nashville. So thank you for the pleasure of doing so, Brad. I'd also like to thank the sponsors who, through their generosity, have made tonight possible, and there are several of them. Greg and Jane Allen, Martin and Kathy Brown, Bill and Trudy Carpenter, Jim and Nikki Cheek, Joe and Judy Cook and the Charis Foundation, Joe and Ashley Cook, Gary and Susan Dean, Bill and Stephanie Dentenhofer, Matt and Ann Dobson, Jim, Emily and Jane Flout, Bill and Elizabeth Hawkins, Clay and Kathy Jackson, Ed and Molly Powell, Steve and Jan Ribbon, Steve and Christy Singleton, and last but certainly not least, Byron and Beth Smith. In addition to our sponsors, there's just a few special guests I'd like to recognize. I know that this is an entire audience of VIPs. We're really delighted that 2 of our trustees are here, Byron Smith, who's also a trustee of Montgomery Bell Academy, as well as Matt Teague, who flew in from Atlanta for the event. And I'm also particularly delighted that the extraordinarily talented Ann Snyder Brooks has joined us this evening along with David. We're so pleased by the turnout and the response for tonight. We actually sold out and had to shut down registration a few days ago. So if you had friends who wanted to be here tonight but could not make it, fear not, there are other opportunities to tune in. Both we and Montgomery Bell Academy will be putting video from this event up on our websites almost immediately. You can also follow along on Facebook, tag your friends, and the like. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Trinity Forum, we work to provide a space and resources for leaders to engage life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And we do this in part by providing readings and publications which draw upon classic works of literature and letters that explore the timeless and enduring questions and bring the wisdom of the humanities to the enduring wisdom of the humanities to the timely questions of the day, as well as sponsoring events like the one tonight, where we try to connect thinking leaders with leading thinkers and engaging those big questions of life, and ultimately coming to better know the author of the answers, as well as how to live and lead more wisely and well. It's been said that the great questions of life and the great questions of the humanities essentially boil down to just 3. What is a good person? What is the good life? And what is the just society? Tall orders. Our speaker tonight will try to wrestle with all 3. And certainly, we're at a time where many traditional ideals about the nature of a good life or a just society are no longer assumed, and in fact, in many quarters, they may be met with reflexive suspicion. The last few years have accelerated and revealed a crisis of character in many of our leaders, and a crisis of confusion in the country. Some of the most powerful leaders in media, politics, business have seen their empires, authority, and reputation crumble in what for some was an overdue reckoning for behavior that for many years was ignored, tolerated, hushed up, or even bragged about, increasing an already growing cynicism about the character of those in power. Meanwhile, commonly held assumptions about what is true have also been eroded. both due to deliberate attempts to manipulate media coverage to serve a particular end, as well as a growing fatigue on the part of the public to sift through the barrage to discern what is real and what is accurate. It has become all too easy, and perhaps at times even a bit pleasurable, to simply consume news and information outlets that reinforce our own preconceptions, reaffirm our grievances, and renounce those who disagree with us. So in such a divided and confused age, how do we think about forming or reforming the character necessary to the good life and reweaving the social fabric that sustains a just society? These are vitally important as well as thoroughly difficult questions, and it's hard to imagine a thinker or a writer who could engage them with more wisdom, insight, eloquence, or good-humored wit than our speaker tonight, David Brooks. Now, while David needs no introduction, he will get one anyway. David serves as an op-ed columnist at the New York Times, where he writes 2 columns a week, a grueling schedule, and actually churned one out today, as well as being a commentator on the PBS NewsHour, NPR's All Things Considered, and NBC's Meet the Press. He previously, early in his career, served as a police reporter for the City News Bureau in Chicago, where he saw lots of action, a writer for the Washington Times, and a book review editor, reporter, occasional movie critic, and later op-ed editor at the Wall Street Journal. He also served as senior editor at the Weekly Standard and a contributing editor at The Atlantic and Newsweek. He's also a best-selling author whose works include Bobo's in Paradise, On Paradise Drive. His third book, The Social Animal, which you may have seen out there, hit #1 on the New York Best Times seller list, as well as his last book, The Road to Character. David Brooks also teaches at Yale University, where he is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. At the conclusion of David's remarks, Brad will facilitate a time of audience questions and answers, so there will be a chance to interact with David. David, welcome.
Thank you, Cherie, dear friend. Now she has to sit up here while you look at her while I'm talking. You better laugh appropriately. It was a pleasure to be preceded by Michael Jackson. I told the boys this morning that I learned to moonwalk recently, but the stage is too small for me to do it here. They managed to sing very well, even though they were a little disappointed. They thought I was Garth Brooks. I had to tell them, no, I'm the guy from Brooks and Dunn. I'm the other guy. It's a great pleasure for my second trip here to MBA. I did a story on Bill Frist about 15 years ago and got to spend a day at the school, and it's a second greatest thrill I could have had in Nashville to speak here. The greatest thrill would be to meet the football team of Brentwood Academy. So always try to warm up the crowd. No, it is a great pleasure, and I will talk about all these themes. I should say beforehand that having written a book on character, I learned that writing a book on character doesn't give you good character, and even reading a book on character doesn't give you good character, but buying a book on character does give you good character. So I hope you'll avail yourselves. I tried to tell the boys a little this morning, you know, you come here, we went to the Token show at Ryman last night, and you see these country music singers, people are called to music. And, you know, I was called at a very early age, at age 7. I read a book called Paddington the Bear, and I decided I want to become a writer. And I remember in high school I wanted to date a young woman named Bernice. She didn't want to date me, she wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. So that was my value system, and that was hers. Unlike the students here, I thought I was a good student in high school. I graduated in the top 85% of my high school class. And the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago, which the famous saying about that is the school where fun goes to die. Though my favorite saying about it is it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. So, it really formed me. I majored in history and celibacy while there, and I wasn't really part of the students like today's students. Today's students, you meet them, they're all amazing. Like you ask them. I always ask my Yale kids, what are you doing at spring break? It's, I'm unicycling across Thailand while reading to lepers, that sort of thing. I did learn some skills that I hope students learn here: how to dominate classroom discussion while doing none of the reading. This is literally true. I had my ups. I managed a boxer named the Kosher Killer. We didn't actually practice boxing, we just read about it. And then he entered in the Golden Gloves in Chicago. I had some downs during a metaphysics exam. I got caught looking into the soul of the student next to me. But then you go on through life and you try to learn how to be impressive. And I actually just read a very good piece my wife gave me on how to look intelligent at meetings, something we all have to do. And this was by a woman named Sarah Cooper. And if somebody's giving a slide presentation at PowerPoint, about halfway through, say, would you go back a slide? And then write something furiously down, and then don't say anything. People will think you're seeing things on a much deeper level than everyone else. Construct a meaningless Venn diagram, like here's the past, here's the future, and we want to be in the sweet spot right in the middle. Say that looks impressive. My favorite one is if somebody mentions a percentage, turn it into a fraction. So they'll say there's a 25% chance of this, and you should say 1 in 4. Interesting. That makes you seem very deep. So I practiced that sort of technique, and I became a TV pundit. I work on a show called The News Hour with Jim Lehrer, on a segment called Shields and Brooks. We wanted to call it Brooks Shields. It would have been better, but they didn't go for that. And because of that, I know if a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. Mr. Brooks, I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it. And I became a columnist in the New York Times, a job I likened to being the chief rabbi at Mecca. And then finally, and then just leading up to my current role, as you get older, you get a little wiser. I became a little more feminine, I think. I'm the only man to have finished that book, Eat, Pray, Love. By page 123, I was lactating. And then I got more into the religious world, and in the Christian world especially, you get introduced to certain words. There's a word winsome, which is commonly said in the Christian world, meaning anybody who doesn't currently want to burn you at the stake. And so that's my run-up to what I really want to talk about today. And I want to give you a narrative of where we are as a country, and a hopeful narrative, but not without its bumps. And basically, I think I'm going to divide our story into 3 eras. And this is going to be a story of progress. There's a woman a philosopher who has the theory that history moves through this method, through what she calls ratchet, hatchet, pivot, and ratchet. That you make some accomplishment and you ratchet up a level, and then the accomplishment sort of wears out and you have to tear it down. And then you pivot, and because of human ingenuity, you ratchet up again. And I do think that's how history moves forward, and we happen to be in one of those pivot moments. And so I'm going to describe the first era, which I think is between 1945 and 1968, which was the generation that went through the World Wars, went through the Depression, and they were very group-oriented and very institutional-oriented. And the slogan for that generation might be, "We're in this together." They're very collective, and a lot of great virtues to that generation, the primary of which was humility. And in the book I describe driving home, listening to NPR, and on the radio shows on Sunday night on NPR, they rebroadcast old radio programs like Dragnet and those kind of programs. And I happened to hear a show called Command Performance, which was a variety show that went out to the troops in World War II. And I happened to hear the episode that was broadcast live on VJ Day, just hours after the Japanese announced their surrender. And Bing Crosby gets out there and he says, "We've just learned we've won this war, but at a moment like this, we're not too proud. We're just humbled, and we're just glad we got through it." And I was struck by that tone of humility. And I got home, turn on a football game, see a quarterback throw a pass to a wide receiver who's tackled after a 2-yard gain, and the defensive player does what all the professional athletes do after moments of achievement. He does a big dance in honor of himself. And it occurred to me I'd seen a bigger self-puffing victory dance after a 2-yard gain than I'd heard after winning World War II. And that symbolized me a shift in a culture of self-effacement that says, I'm no better than anybody else, but nobody's better than me, to a culture of achievement. Look what I've done, look what I've done. And that code of humility really carried that generation. I covered George H.W. Bush when he first was running for president. And he was in that generation, youngest flyer in World War II. And he hated to talk about himself, because the code was you don't talk about yourself. And he was running for president, and the staff would beat him up and say, George, you got to talk about yourself. You're running for president. Tell him why you'd be a great president. So in one speech he did it, he included the paragraph that he usually cut out of why he's really talented to be president. And his mom, who was still alive, called him up and said, George, you're talking about yourself again. And so he cut that out. And that was a virtue of that generation. And out of that humility came a character model. And the model was, you find your personal sin and you work on improving it every single day. That the inner confrontation with your own weakness is the primary way you build character. For Dwight Eisenhower, who we wrote about in the book, it was anger, passion. He had a temper problem. And every day at night he would work on that temper. He had some cheap devices, like he'd put names on a piece of paper of people he hated and rip it up and throw it in the garbage can as a way to purge his anger. And he made himself into a very wonderful person out of that confrontation with themselves. Humility was the chief virtue, pride was the greatest vice. And that culture had a lot of real virtue. And I think the chief one we miss is an institutional mindset. The idea that we inherit institutions, we go into them, we accept the standards of those institutions, and we try to pass them along better to the next generation. George Marshall felt that way about the U.S. Army. I'm sure people at this institution felt they were stewards of an institution. But it had weaknesses. The weaknesses included racism tolerated, sexism tolerated, anti-Semitism, emotional coldness. The fathers were sometimes very rough on their sons. They didn't know how to express their feelings. Extremely boring food in that era. And a lot of conformity, not as much creativity. And that era had to be destroyed. Because when a culture that's an information age economy, or there's going to be a lot of creativity, and when we're going to widen opportunity for women and minorities, something had to change. And the change happened in about 1969. And I talk in the book about this paradigmatic moment, Super Bowl III. If anybody remembers Super Bowl III, one of the quarterbacks on one side of the field was Johnny Unitas, very 1950s figure, crew cut, high-heeled or high ankle boots, very plodding. He would leave the field every day and say, whenever I left the field, I always thought of something extremely boring to tell the press, because don't be too flashy. The other side of the field, a guy named Joe Namath, from the same Beaver Falls town in western Pennsylvania, but 10 years apart. And Joe Namath was flashy, a swinger, a big drinker, $4,000 fur coats. He wrote a memoir called I Can't Wait Until Tomorrow Because I Get Better Looking Every Day. Johnny Unitas would not have called his memoir that. And so you saw a shift. And what I want to emphasize was it wasn't only a shift in politics, it was a shift in the way to be, a way of being. It was better to be old rather than mature, to be sensitive rather than reticent, to be casual rather than formal, to be an outsider rather than an insider. And the whole way of being just shifted very quickly. And so it wasn't we're in this together, it was I'm free to be myself. It was individualistic, it was freedom-oriented, and it was creative. And that culture was powered, and in the transition moments, what powers a transition moment is not individuals, it's not even politicians, it's social movements. Groups of people leading a movement on what's admirable. So we had the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the peace movement, the hippies, the rock music. We had artists like Jack Kerouac, Norman Mailer, Andy Warhol. They just changed how people wanted to be. And it led to a lot of good things, a lot of creativity. A lot of our internet culture comes from the creativity of the 1960s. A lot of our grocery stores, I wrote in one of my books about 1960s style grocery stores like Trader Joe's and Whole Foods, where all the cashiers look like they're on loan from Amnesty International, sort of progressive grocery stores. And then it quickly turned into a meritocratic culture. All that freedom led people to create a culture in which there would be no barriers to personal success. And I don't know what, and it led to a sort of hyper-achievement or ethos, which we see in a lot of schools today. I don't know what the carpool line is like at MBA, but in a lot of progressive neighborhoods, the carpool line, you get these Audis, Saabs, and Volvos pulling up because it's socially acceptable to have a luxury car so long as it comes from a country hostile to U.S. foreign policy. That's fine. These women get out. I wrote about it in one of my books called Uber Moms, who are highly successful career women who take time off to make sure all their kids can get into Harvard. And you can tell the Uber Moms because they actually weigh less than their own children. Sort of like at the moment of conception, they're like cutting the umbilical cord themselves, or at the moment of delivery, cutting the umbilical cord themselves, flashing little Mandarin flashcards at the things, get them ready for Harvard. And that created a meritocracy, which is the world around us. And it's been going for a long time. But that culture, too, we have a tendency to take our cultures a little too far. And that hyper-individualistic culture created the crisis we're living in today, which is a crisis of social solidarity. Basically, all that individual, all that I'm free to be me, it tore away at the covenantal bonds that really bind us. It tore away at the bonds of family, the bonds of neighborhood. It tore away at our national creed, our common moral culture, and tore up what you might call the biblical metaphysics, the basic biblical understandings that underpinned our society. And it created three big problems. The first is a completely destroyed social fabric, especially for those who are less well off. It created a rise of distrust. It used to be if you asked people, do you trust your neighbors? A clear majority said, yeah, my neighbors are trustworthy. Now if you ask that question, 32% of Americans say my neighbors are trustworthy, and only 19% of millennials. There's a tremendous rise in the number of people living alone. It used to be 8%, now it's about 24%. In some cities it's 40%. The fastest growing political party is unaffiliated. The fastest growing religious group is unaffiliated. There's been an epic rise in loneliness. Among Americans over 45 years old, 35% are chronically lonely. There are 9 million men who dropped out of the labor force and they're basically at home collecting disability and playing suicide games. We've seen a rise in suicide rates, and suicide is a proxy for loneliness, so that we now have 25% more suicides every year than people die in car crashes. We've seen this rise in opiate addiction, and opiate addiction is just slow motion suicide, and it's born also out of loneliness. The second problem that's come out of this is the meritocracy, this self-confident cultural movement, is good on what in the book we call the resume virtues. It's really bad on the eulogy virtues, the things that give life meaning. A lot of the kids I see at Yale come into school with a lot more clear conception of how to build a career than how to build a good character. And so it's created this system where they know how to get anywhere they want, but they don't know why they're getting there. And so what I see among some of my students in the mid-20s is they've turned everything into an admissions game. They're good at getting admitted into places. And then they get out of college and they get admitted into Goldman Sachs, or they get admitted into McKinsey, and then they have their first big professional crisis, and the collapse comes. I call it the telos crisis. They don't know what their purpose is. Nietzsche says, he who has a why to live for can endure any how. If you know why you're doing something, you can handle the setbacks. If you don't know why, when the bad times comes, the collapse comes. And there's this great element of fearfulness because everything's sort of on an unsolid foundation. They're building stacks and stacks and stacks of accomplishment on a foundation made of quicksand, which should be their purpose. And so there's this fear that it's all going to come down. A friend of mine had a job interview, and he asked the interviewer at the end of the interview, he turned to her and asked her a question. And the question was, what would you do if you weren't afraid? A very good question. And she started crying because she wouldn't be doing HR if she wasn't afraid. And I asked my students that, and every year I get out of my class, 2 or 3 say, I wouldn't be at Yale. I don't really want to be here, it's not my kind of place, but I can't give up the brand. And so that pressure leads to a loss of meaning. And then the third big effect is the loss of a national narrative. We had a national narrative in this country that sustained us for decades or centuries, really, and it was an exodus narrative. The Puritans brought it over with them. We flee from oppression, we go across the wilderness, and we try to settle a land of milk and honey. And every immigrant group that came into this country embraced this exodus narrative. Whether it was the Jews, the Italians, the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King talked about Moses more than he did Jesus, because again, it was a journey. I have a dream to get to the promised land. And that was our national narrative, and it gave us a sense of national purpose. I spoke about the telos crisis for kids. We didn't have it because we knew what our telos was, to be the last best hope of Earth, to realize democracy for the entire Earth, to be the universal nation. We lost touch with that, I think, maybe because we're uncomfortable with biblical categories, maybe a loss of civic education, but that narrative has gone away, and now we have a bunch of different competing narratives. We have a libertarian narrative that says each of us individuals are in it for ourselves. We have a tech narrative that we're all citizens of a global world in search of disruption. We have the multicultural narrative that we're all part of competing ethnic groups, and whoever was victimized the most is the most prestigious. And frankly, we have the narrative that Donald Trump articulates, which is the good, solid people in the middle of America are oppressed by outsiders, either at the elites or Muslims or Mexicans or from outside. And frankly, that has never been the traditional American narrative. That's actually the traditional Russian narrative. But it plays here and appeal to a lot of people. And what do narratives do? One of the things they do is my wife and I were at a meeting, just a discussion group at lunch today, and she made the point that narratives, you're not only a member of a group, but because of a narrative that you believe in and a culture you believe in, that you're willing to submit to it. And by submitting to an institution, by submitting to a group, you're willing to get yourself changed and transformed by it. And if you don't fundamentally trust it and give it that sense of credibility, you can't let it do its work on you, and you can't be changed by it. When you have a common narrative, you sense, okay, we've got these differences, we've got big civil rights problems, but we're still basically all in this together. And that's why Martin Luther King talked about the Declaration so often. We're basically still all in this together. The third thing a narrative gives you, it gives you a pathway for forgiveness. When bad things happen, we forgive each other because we're part of the same family. And then finally, it gives you the sense of grace giving. You give grace because you're all basically in this together. And these are the things that deepen love, that bond community, and create a sense of meaning and purpose that is the unconscious guidance system for all of life. And so the old order, this meritocratic, I'm free to be myself order, did a lot of great things, but it's collapsing. Some of you have probably read a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. He says scientists have a paradigm that fits the facts as they know them, and it lasts for a long time, but then new facts come in, and the paradigm isn't working so well. And somebody comes along and just pokes it, and it collapses. And then you have a period of competing paradigms. Well, that's what we had. We had a certain structure for our society, and it really wasn't serving us anymore. And Donald Trump came along at the Republican primaries, and he poked it, and it all collapsed. And he emerged triumphant. I did a column comparing him to, if you remember, Abbie Hoffman. Abbie Hoffman was not a great political mind, but he was great at political theater. And he was a 60s figure, and he took that old order, the first one I described, and he put together a bunch of political theater that exposed its hollowness, and he brought it down. And so to me, Donald Trump is Abbie Hoffman for our day. And so what he's good at is he sees where we're weak. Divides like urban, rural, black, white, rich, poor, left, right, and he pokes at those divides. And I'm not sure he's going to build anything, but he might. But he's certainly exposing where we're weak. And so the global populist movement is, to me, it's the wrong answer, but it's the wrong answer to the right questions. It raised the right questions. And what we see is Trump, and not just Trump, and this is why there's a transitional moment, and not just like any random thing. At a transitional moment in history, whether it's 1848 or 1905 or 1968, a lot of countries all around the world are facing the same problem in different ways. And we see the global populist movement all around the world. And I got to spend some time with Steve Bannon a couple weeks ago, and it was like having lunch with Trotsky in 1905. I mean, he had a 100-year plan. He said, well, Pat Buchanan was a moment, Donald Trump is a moment, we're working to take over the US Senate, then we're going to take over some of the think tanks in Washington, and we're going to take this all over in 50 years. He had this big vision. And he had a clear sense of all the international alliances, a clear sense of how illiberal forces around the world were on the march. And when you talk to the global populists, whether it's in the Brexit people in England, Bannon here, or anywhere around the world, they have a coherent ideology, a coherent sense of community they offer their people, and a clear world historical plan. And so to me, they're not the problem, they're a symptom of the problem, and I am not a populist. But when I look at the people who are not populists, the people more on my side, what I see are people who are defending liberalism, defending not in the democratic sense, but in the old John Locke sense, individual rights, freedom, openness to trade, openness to ideas, openness to immigration, the covenantal relationships that served as the foundation for that. And I look at people on my side, and we are dispersed, we're confused by events, we're on our back feet, and we're constantly being run over. And I saw this throughout the Republican primary, especially on the Republican side, and I see it among the establishment Republicans, including even Paul Ryan today. They still don't know how to deal with Trump and the populists. They still think, oh, if we pass this tax bill, that'll solve it. They don't understand the depth of the problem. They don't really know the situation they're in. And so I see one side on the march and one side going backwards. And so to me, it seems to me what we need is first, we need an understanding that populism is not the problem. The collapse of the old order is the problem, that we're in a transitional moment, and that we're not going back to 1994, just as in 1968 they weren't going back to 1955. The second thing is if the populists have a social movement, a lot of us who believe in open trade, believe in open exchange of ideas, we need a social movement. You can only drive change with a social movement, with organizations. If you could do it through column writing, that would be awesome. But you can't. The third thing we need is a different covenant, a different national covenant. What are we here for? What binds us together? Upon which do we build our grace for each other? And that depends ultimately on a different way of being. And the Christian faith is a good model here. We're not all going to launch new religions. But Jesus came into the Holy Land at a time when the Israelites were fighting with the Romans, two radically different cultures. The Romans believed in dominance and glory and honor, and the Israelites believed in law, and they were two different cultures. And Jesus came in the middle of this war. 150,000 people died in the war before Jesus came, in the century before he came. And he said, well, I'm not with you, I'm leaping beyond. I'm going to give you a set of beliefs and a way of living that's totally beyond what you two are fighting about. And his idea, we were talking about earlier, of a leader getting down and washing the feet of somebody else, that would have been inconceivable to a Roman leader. That is not the way a Caesar behaved. But Jesus was offering something higher. And so we need a different way of being. And to me, we're not going to go back to we're all in this together. We're not going back to the authoritarian views of collectivity. And we can't stay with, I'm free to be myself, because it's tearing us up. So to me, and my hope is we go to an ethos that says, I commit to you. I commit to you. And I've been spending the last few years thinking about commitment making. And it seems to me most of us in our lives make four big commitments: to a spouse and a family, to a vocation, to a philosophy or faith, and to a community. And the fulfillment of our lives depends on how well we choose those commitments and how well we execute upon them. And a commitment is making a promise. A commitment is making a promise when you don't expect a reward. When you make a promise getting married, you may get a reward, but that's not why you made the promise. You made the promise out of love. And a commitment is also falling in love with something and then building a structure of behavior around it for those moments when love falters. You fall in love, but you get a legal marriage because there's going to be moments when you're not so crazy about each other, but you've built a structure of behavior to keep you through those moments. And making a commitment is the kind of thing that Ruth made to Naomi. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Commitments give us our identities. If we didn't have our commitments that anchored us into things over decades, we just wander about in the changeability of our hearts. Commitments give us our sense of purpose. The Gallup organization asked people all around the world, do you have a sense of meaning and purpose in your life? And they asked people in countries all around the world. The country around the world where most people had a sense of meaning and purpose was Liberia. The bottom country was the Netherlands. And it wasn't because life was so great in Liberia. It was because to survive, they had to really commit to each other. And those people had a sense of meaning and purpose. The third thing does commitments form our character. When you make a promise to something, you are making a promise that will pull you in ways that are better, that make you better than you are, in ways you can't even imagine. I don't tell this story much, but when my oldest son was born, he came out with a very low APGAR score, like a 3. They rushed him off to the ICU, and I remember thinking at that time, you know, if he only lives 45 minutes and we have to endure a lifetime of grief, it will still be worth it. Now, there's no cost-benefit analysis by which that makes sense. But when you become a parent and you come to realize the dignity of human life and the infinite dignity of life, suddenly it begins to make sense. And suddenly your very logic is changed by the commitment that has been thrust upon you, and you become a different person. And so what our commitments do to us is they demand a different mentality. And the way I would say it is a committed life, a life that's of deep commitments, makes one more emotional and less cognitive, more moral and less utilitarian, more communal and less individualistic. First, the emotional life. A life of a commitment, and parents to kids, love of country, love of school, it keeps the emotions open and raw, and you're bound by your love. There's a great passage in a book by Louis de Bernier called Captain Corelli's Mandolin. And it's an old guy talking to his daughter about his love for his late wife. And he says, love itself is what is left over when being in love is burned away. And this is both an art and a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. We had roots that grew toward each other underground, and when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we found that we were one tree and not two. That's a marital commitment. That's a commitment when you become one thing. And so that grows out of fierce emotional passion that bonds two people together. The second thing that commitments call forth is a commitment is a promise morally validated that you feel bound to keep. And keeping that promise arouses something deep in the soul. I told the young boys today, the students today, that about a guy who bought a house with a bamboo tree. And the bamboo tree was next to his driveway. And the guy hated bamboo. So he chopped down the tree, and all that's left was the root system. So he took an axe, and he chopped up all the roots. Then he dug a 2-foot deep hole, poured plants poison into the hole, then covered it with gravel, and then covered it with cement. 2 years later, a bamboo shoot shoots up through the hole. And each of us has that in us. And that's what emerges from our soul, a moral yearning to be a good person, to have a meaningful life. And you can cover it over with career, you can cover it over with money, you can cover it over with whatever you want, but the shoot eventually shoots up there, and it asks you, what have you done with your life? What have you called to do? What service have you rendered? Have you become a person capable of unselfish love? And if you haven't answered the questions, you've got to compensate in some way. And if you haven't thought about the questions, you are aware of that. And so that moral drive, I think, is the primary drive. That was Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. The search for meaning is the essential search. And it drives us, and it's hard to make sense of without promises, without commitments. And then finally, a life of commitment is not only a more emotional life, a more morally out there life, it's also a more social life, being vulnerable in the shape of attack. And saying, I will not live by the world's and by the standards of the individualistic culture in which I was raised. The world around us right now says, celebrate your independence, but a committed person says, no, I celebrate my dependence. Our culture today says, celebrate self-creation, the things you create yourself. But a committed life says, no, I celebrate the institutions that form me, that are deeper than choice. The world today says, celebrate autonomy. But a committed person says, no, I celebrate relationship, not autonomy. The world outside says, use your full agency. You're in control of your life. Use the active voice. A committed person says, no, I don't use the active voice. I don't use the passive voice. I use what Eugene Peterson calls the middle voice, which is the voice of confrontation and listening and response. The world celebrates negative freedom. I want to be unrestrained to do whatever I want. The committed person celebrates positive freedom. I want to have the capacities and skills to do the things I really want to do. And that involves restraining your freedom. You have to chain yourself to the piano to have the freedom to really play these things. The world is neutral about the proper ends of your life. You shall all march to the beat of your own drummer. But the committed person says, no, we're not neutral about these things. We are in favor of selfless service to some committed good. And so it's what I've tried to describe first is a new sort of person, and which we can only just begin to imagine that a committed person would involve. I also would think that we would need to create different sorts of institutions, and we may be sitting in one. Some institutions are thin, and some institutions are thick. A thin institution is what people get together to just get mutual interest out of. You can pass through such an institution, and it won't leave a mark on you. I went to the University of Chicago, and it was permanently left a mark on me. It was a thick institution. The Marine Corps, every time I meet a Marine, it's a thick institution. It leaves a mark. My wife went to Wheaton College, thick institution, leaves the mark. Spelman, these kinds of schools, you know them. You know the people when you meet them, and MBA, I think, falls into this category. And so I've been thinking about what is a thick institution? What separates it from a thin one? Well, a thick institution is not one that people use instrumentally. A thick institution becomes part of their identity. It's who they are. Thick institutions have physical locations where people meet face to face, often in a packed gym or an assembly hall. Thick institutions have collective ritual, fasting, reciting, standing in formations. Thick institutions have shared tasks, which involve people watching each other. Such institutions often tell a sacred origin story or a near-death experience for the story, and they celebrate the heroes who created them. They often involve sleeping overnight, seeing each other before breakfast and after dinner when the guards are down and the makeup is off. They often involve music, putting music into every ritual because it's hard to be distant to somebody you've danced with. And so these institutions are different than the instrumental individualistic institutions that we have today. And then finally, one of the things that these institutions do is they give us a revolution in consciousness. And really, if we're going to get out of the way we're stuck today, which is an atomized, distanced, unrivaled, or unconnected society, we just need new institutions. It's really striking to me in 1905, an era very much like this one, when they were passing to the industrial age, they were great builders. They built these institutions. Some were government, like the Federal Reserve System. Some were not government, like the temperance movement or the progressive movement, the Boy Scouts. For some reason, we're in a transitional moment, and we haven't actually built as many movements. Maybe because we're just now grappling with what we've got. But I do expect these movements will be building. You see the burbling around in culture. And what's interesting to me is that I see young and old doing it together. There is a generation gap more than there was 10 years ago, but I see so many young people looking for a community, but then I see so many people in the first 10 years of retirement. I have this theory that we all have two mountains to climb. We get out of school and we think our first mountain is we think, oh, that's my mountain, that's what I'm going to climb. I'm going to build a family, I'm going to build a career, and that's my mountain. And so you work for years building the stuff, building the identity, building the ego, building your place in the world. And then you achieve that mountain, and it's not that satisfying. or you get knocked off that mountain and you're down in the valley again. Or some bad event happens, like the death of a child, and that mountain becomes irrelevant to your life. And it's at that point you realize, no, that actually wasn't my mountain. There's another mountain, which is a second mountain. And the things that satisfy you in the first half of life no longer satisfy you. And the first mountain is building up the ego, building up the identity. The second mountain is giving away the identity and offering forth service for the community. And the people on their second mountain, sometimes they shift their lives radically. They move to Tibet. Sometimes the woman who founded this company now spends all her time in the Central Valley of California doing pre-K programs, doing nursery school programs, doing health centers to combat diabetes. She's sort of lost interest in her company. But if you go to the pre-K program with her, she knows the first names of all the kids. And she's discovered her second mountain. And when you're on that mountain, you're just in a different world. I mentioned Viktor Frankl, and I'll close with this. Frankl really became a specialist in the search for meaning. He was a psychiatrist in the 1930s, and he was captured by the Nazis, thrown into Auschwitz. And he said, hey, this wasn't what I expected from life. This wasn't what I asked for. And so he realized, well, that's actually the wrong question. The question is not, what do I want from life? The real question is, what is life asking of me? What are my circumstances asking me to do? And he said, well, I'm a psychiatrist. I'm in Auschwitz. I'll study suffering. And so he studied suffering. And the question he asked was, why do some people only live here for a couple weeks and then they die? But some people are able to survive months and even years. And he came to the conclusion that the people who could survive months and years had made a commitment to something outside the camp. They thought of writing a book when they got out, and that kept them alive. They talked to their wives. He ran into one guy who said to him, listen, if I don't get back to my wife, and if you should see her again, then tell her that I talked of her daily and hourly. Second, I have loved her more than anyone. Third, the short time I have been married to her outweighs everything, even all we have gone through here. And the other thing he found about them is that life had taken away everything external, but the survivors were able to live internally on their spiritual nature. He found a young woman who was dying at the nursery in the infirmary, and she was in a bed, trapped there, unable to move, getting weaker by the day. And she said to him, I am grateful fate has hit me so hard. In my former life, I was spoiled and did not take spiritual accomplishments seriously. And they were talking, and she said, I only really have one friend here on this tree, on this bed, and it's a tree out my window, a chestnut tree. And she said, I often talk to this tree. And Frankl said to her, well, does the tree talk back to you? And she says, yes, the tree talks to me. And he said, well, what does it say? And the tree says, I am life, I am life, I am eternal life. And that's transcendence. She'd achieved transcendence. And that's a form of joy, even on her deathbed. And that's why people go to the second mountain. That's why social movements recover, because this inner yearn to serve what we love is so deep within us. And the final thing to be said, and I think this is the final shift away from the culture we're leaving, we put a lot of faith on agency in this culture, that I take control, I'm in charge, active voice. But as I mentioned, that middle voice is the more realistic one. You call and I respond. Then I talk and you listen and you respond. It's a series of conversations. And I think that is the noblest way we are called to do the best things that we do. And I'll close with my hero, St. Augustine, who lived 15 or 1600 years ago in Africa. And he gets this sense of middle voice, this sense of call and response, that I'm not creating my world, but I'm trying to respond the best way I can. Late have I loved you, beauty so ancient and so new, late have I loved you. Lo, before you were within, but I was outside seeking you there. And upon the shapely things you have made, I rushed headlong, misshapen. You were with me, but I was not with you. They held me back, these material things held me back from you. Those things that would have no being were they not in you, you called. You shouted, you broke through my deafness. You flared, blazed, banished my blindness. You lavished your fragrance, I gasped, and now I pant for you. I tasted you, and now I hunger and thirst. You touched me, and I burn for your peace. Those final few lines get the intensity of being called, and especially being called by God. You called, shouted, broke through my deafness. You flared, blazed, and banished my blindness. You lavished your fragrance, I gasped, and now I pant for you. I tasted you, and now I hunger and thirst. You touched me, and I burn for your peace. And that's why it's always useful to be optimistic in the long run, because humans are insanely ingenious. But most of all, we've been created to yearn for this. You rarely meet anybody who's not yearning to create a better world, and we will figure out how to do it. Thank you.
We have a little time for some questions, and there are 3 rules. First, be brief. Secondly, be civil. And thirdly, ask what you want to say in the form of a question. So if somebody would like to begin, I'll call on you, and we'll proceed in the center. Greatest work of history ever is Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. And one of the points he makes in there is that in politics, the lows are lower than the highs are high. When politicians screw up, the errors they make are more grave than the benefits you get when they do really well. And so if you're in politics, it's best to be careful and cautious and incremental. I'm a follower of a philosopher named Edmund Burke, and he said change should be incremental, gradual, but relentless. And his phrase was epistemological modesty. Epistemology is the study of what we can know, and modesty is modesty. The world's more complicated than what you should know and what you can know, so just try to behave modestly in its face. And there was a lot of hubris in planning the Vietnam War, and frankly, in a war I supported, the Iraq War. And it's just, you have to be cognizant of how modest the changes can be, and how modest, frankly, political action can lead to in our society. I cover politics. I really care about politics. I tell students, get into politics. It really matters. If you don't get into politics, it'll get into you. So you might as well get there first. But we can't make politics an idol. We can't make politics our ethnic pride, our moral basis. Politics is a lever of life, but the most important things of life are our relationships, our culture, our values. And if you make politics into an idol, you'll see people tolerating awful behavior just so their party can win.
About 20% of society is pulling away in terms of opportunity and education, and that is a really big problem. There is a gap in our culture between those have a chance for education also for comment on that concept.
The question was about a book called Dream Orders, which was written by a guy named Richard Reeves at the Brookings Institution, and his argument was it's not the top 1% and the bottom 99, it's the top 20 and the bottom 80. And that people who are succeeding basically in the educational system are pulling away. And I think it's totally correct. The average college-educated parent spends $5,200 per year per kid just on extracurricular activities. There's no way high school educated families can afford that. And so if you go to public high schools around the country, the children of college educated are twice as likely to play football because they've just got the home life that can support that sort of thing. And so if you come from a family making $96,000 a year, your odds of getting through college are 1 in 2. And if you come from a family making $36,000, your odds are 1 in 17. So the family you're born into just makes a tremendous difference on your success in life. And it's not because people are cheating. Richard sort of makes the point, oh, they're cheating. It's not because they're cheating, and frankly, I'm part of this. It's because we're playing the system. We're trying to pass on all we can to our children. The system is working the way it's supposed to be working. And this is it, but it takes it off into a stratospheric level. I just was with a Yale law professor who's written a book on extreme work. The number of people in finance and medicine and law who are working 80 hours a week. And his argument is that people who are making these super salaries up there, they're actually earning it. They're working phenomenally hard. They're killing the rest of their lives, and they're hyper-productive. It's just that they've sacrificed everything else to do it. And so the meritocracy is sort of working the way it's supposed to, but it's creating these divisions. And how do you deal with that is a big, sticky problem.
Yes?
Speaking about the value of life and how we seem to be losing it. If you look at certain cultures in big areas, ghetto cities, underprivileged areas, constant taking of life. And they don't seem to realize or care. Life has no value. How do you change that culture?
You know, I would say in the areas where there's a high murder rate, I wouldn't say life has no value. I would say there are precious few supplies of dignity. And the way you can get a sense of dignity is the way, frankly, one of my heroes, Alexander Hamilton, did it by manly display of honor. And he fought a duel which cost him his life. And the Greek and Roman system was built on duels that cost lives. And basically, if you're in a gang culture, what I used to cover in Chicago, they're looking for ways they can feel like fully realized human beings, and they happen to be in a world where manly display of violence and courage is the way. And out of that, you get death, and this was a problem the Greeks struggled with in that culture. All of the Greek tragedies are about, or many of them, are about what do you do in a culture of revenge and honor and fighting. And that is just, my favorite movie of all time is a movie I hope some of you have seen called The Searchers by John Wayne, a John Ford movie. And he's a soldier. He fought for the Confederacy, came back, and he's fighting against the Indians, and he's basically a good man. But he is a man of honor and a man of violence. And after he's conquered the people who've kidnapped a member of his family, the final scene is of the doorpost of a home. Everyone else gets to go into the home and live a good, peaceful domestic life. He's a warrior. He can't get back in. He has no place in a decent society. And so he's perpetually exiled to the land of war. And frankly, a lot of kids are raised in a culture of war, and unfortunately they've been exiled to that land of war. They cry over their kids just like anybody else when the deaths happen. The neighborhoods are traumatized just like anybody else. But there's a very understandable culture of honor and violence and counter-violence, especially just among those gangs, not among the neighborhoods as a whole.
Yes?
I really appreciate the message you were sharing about the way to change culture is by creating movements, social movements, not individuals. The challenge I'm having with that message is that we seem to be on social media, there's a new movement coming out like every other week, you know? So how you're sharing a message of being modest and humble, being committed, things are not very sexy right now. How do we actually create that kind of influence in this environment where everyone's trying to make their own brand, their own hashtag, or whatever it is?
Yeah. Well, we don't want to get married to a movement, but we're stuck in a speed dating world. And I see it at Yale. The movements sweep through Yale. The students are hungry for some sort of spiritual life, which has not been given to them. So they grab onto whatever they can grab onto, and often it's very crude, and often they want to shout down speakers, but at least it's a moral yearning, combined sometimes with a panic about how anarchic their lives are. But they've been so steeped in the culture. First, they're afraid of not being on the cutting edge of every social movement. One of my students said, if a movement sweeps through campus, boycott Israel, boycott, I don't know, Spain, boycott Barcelona, I don't know, whatever, and you don't post on Facebook in support of the movement, then people noticed and you're punished. That's like a cultural Mao revolution, like we've always got to say what we want. But the problem is there's such a deep institutional mindset that a lot of people are suspicious of movements, suspicious of institutions, and they think it's good enough to hashtag something. And the answer to them is, which movement had the most effect on America, the Tea Party or Occupy? And Occupy didn't believe in institutions, everything was free form, and it withered. And the Tea Party actually did believe in structures, and they elected a guy president. And so you got to get with the program that says, no, we're going to build a structure, and we're going to build something that'll last beyond our lifetime. But a lot of people raised in this culture have trouble with that idea of a complete organization because they're suspicious of authority. But if you want to get change, you got to get over that.
2 more questions. Yes?
You stressed the importance of finding a common narrative to overcome all these problems. How do you see us being able to do that now with everything being politicized? And also, it's no longer, I disagree with your point. Your point is wrong, and you're a battery. How do we come together with some sort of common narrative where we have a common goal there? Dropping those common.
Well, if Canada would do us a favor and invade us, we would all bond together and we could fight back. You know, I frankly, like I was raised in the Exodus narrative. I was raised in a family with a strong immigrant mentality, and that's what we believed in. And so frankly, I may be too old. I have trouble thinking beyond it. I have trouble thinking about the next one. Maybe we can go back to the Exodus narrative, maybe we can't. But I will say it's insufficient. Like a lot of people say, well, we have to meet with people unlike ourselves. And I totally agree with that. I think all of us have a responsibility to be part of an organization that includes members that we meet with once a month completely unlike us. Whether it's rich, poor, black, white, super lefty, super NRA, just have that human contact. But to me, it's insufficient. It's insufficient because the populists, and again, I'm someone who's opposed to what they're doing, they don't just have get-togethering. They have a movement. They have a vision. They have a set of convictions they really believe in. You can't fight a vision with a process of just getting together. And a lot of us fall into the trap that we're out, relationships are what matter most. And so we have coffee, we have a meeting, we have a discussion, then we have tea, then we have drinks, and we have coffee, and we fill our calendars with relationships, but at the end of the month you think, well, what did we actually do? And so, yeah, we drank a lot of coffee. But so to me, you got to have a purpose, and the populists had that sense of purpose. And frankly, America had that sense of purpose. When the Puritans landed here, they saw the abundance of this place. And they had 2 visions. One, that God's plan for humanity would be completed here, and 2, they would get really rich in the process. And so we are a moral, materialistic culture. And there was an assumption as people were going west through Ohio and Cincinnati, the historians would record this, and through Tennessee, people would pass by perfectly good farmland because they assumed there was even better farmland just in the next valley. And so it was that pull of the future. And we were known as the nation of the future. And now if you look at our politics, we're a nation of nostalgia. Some people want to go back to the social mores of the 1950s. Some people want to go back to the unions of the 1950s. But I hope that the Exodus story remains our story. But if that's in the past, then maybe it'll be up to somebody younger to figure out what the next story is. But you have to have a story.
One last question.
Today we see a lot of institutions that become unraveled because of the frailty of the member of the institution. It used to be that there was a separation between those who belong and what the institution stood for. Today it seems more than ever the failing of one person and the whole institution
This is a poignant question for me today. It's about why the failure of one individual can destroy a whole institution, whereas the institution can't last. And I often did a show on PBS called The Charlie Rose Show. And Charlie Rose, some of you may have read, is the latest to be exposed. And I'll miss that show. I think the show with Charlie clearly did some very horrific things, which I do not defend or apologize for. But you miss a show. That's part of human frailty, but the cost has to be borne because the consequences have to be faced. I'll say two things. Having a belief in institutions and having a sense that they're bigger than any of us. George Marshall, when he was in the U.S. Army, he knew the Army had created him. He was not an impressive 20-year-old. But he went to VMI, then he went into the Army, and it made him. And so he had a code that said, I will never put my own needs above the Army's. And when FDR was choosing who was going to run the D-Day invasion, this was something Marshall really wanted to do. But he had a code, I will never advocate for myself. And so FDR asked him, would you like to run the D-Day invasion? And Marshall said, it's not about what I want, it's about what you want. Put your own interests first, or the Army's interests first. And FDR asked him 4 times, and 4 times Marshall said, it's not about me. And FDR took the chance to give the job to Eisenhower. And that's somebody putting institutions first, having a clear sense institutions are higher. And I'll end on this. If you ever get a sense that, if you ever want to get cheered up, Google Ryne Sandberg Hall of Fame speech. Ryne Sandberg was a second baseman of the Chicago Cubs. And he was inducted in the Hall of Fame, I can't remember, about 2002 maybe. And he said, I just played the game the way I was taught to play it and the way the people who stood on this field before me played it. So that meant if I hit a double, I just ducked my head down and I ran to second. If I hit a home run, I didn't celebrate, I just ran around the bases. If I was asked to do a bunt, I just did a bunt. I just wanted to follow the standards that were set before me and pass them along. And thinking institutionally, and a lot of what I'm describing, come to think of it, is having a different conception of time. A long conception that we're all part of a story that transcends us, and that we're just little blips on that story. And then a person doesn't become the institution is the institution. And the things that last over centuries are more transcendent and are more noble than any of us individually could be, because we are produced by them. And as I mentioned, I was at MBA studying Bill Frist, and why I'm just studying the Senate Majority Leader. Why would I come to this place he went to school so many years before? It's because MBA formed him. And that's an example that we're sitting in the middle of an institution that creates the human beings that pass through it, of whom there are decade after decade, generation after generation. Thank you.